Welcome, time travelers. SolaTales here, and tonight's adventure takes us to the golden age of medieval trade, where we'll join three weary merchants as their camel caravan finds rest along the ancient Silk Road, sharing exotic treasures by firelight before drifting off to sleep beneath a canopy of infinite desert stars. So, dim the lights, sit back, and relax. The ancient path stretched endlessly before them, a ribbon of packed earth worn smooth by countless generations of travelers. The year was 1347, and the caravan moved with the gentle, hypnotic rhythm that had carried merchants across these desert lands for over 1,000 years. Each footstep fell softly on the sun-warmed sand, creating a peaceful percussion that mingled with the soft tinkling of camel bells and the quiet conversations of weary travelers. Hassan al-Dimashqi adjusted the silk-wrapped bundle on his shoulder as he walked beside his favorite camel, a patient beast named Kamar, whose coat had turned silver gray after many journeys along this route between Samarkand and Kashgar. The Damascus merchant had been trading these paths for 15 years now, and he knew the subtle signs that told him sunset was approaching. The quality of light had begun to change, shifting from the harsh white glare of midday to something softer, more golden, that seemed to emanate from the very sand beneath their feet. Behind him, Li Wei guided a string of 3 camels loaded with carefully wrapped porcelain from his family's workshops in Xi'an. Each piece had been individually wrapped in layers of raw silk and sheep's wool, then nestled in wooden crates filled with sawdust and dried grass. The Chinese merchant moved with quiet precision, checking and rechecking the cargo ties with the methodical care of someone who understood that a single broken jar could represent months of a craftsman's patient work. The porcelain pieces clinked softly against their protective wrappings, creating a delicate music that added to the evening's gentle symphony. Amara bint Yusuf walked near the front of the caravan, her keen nose already detecting the subtle shift in the desert air that spoke of approaching night. The spice trader from Bukhara carried with her the aromatic treasures of a dozen kingdoms: cinnamon bark from the island of Ceylon, cardamom pods still fragrant from the western Ghats of India, precious saffron threads worth their weight in silver, and star anise from the distant mountains of China. The leather satchels that held these treasures had been treated with cedar oil and lined with oiled silk to preserve their precious contents during the long desert crossing. The caravan consisted of 47 people and 63 camels, moving in the traditional formation that had evolved over centuries of desert travel. The most experienced guides rode at the front and rear, their weathered eyes constantly scanning the horizon for the landmarks that would guide them safely to water and shelter. Between them traveled the merchants, pilgrims, and craftsmen who formed the living heart of Silk Road commerce, each person carrying not just goods but stories, knowledge, and dreams across the vast expanse of Central Asia. As the afternoon progressed, the sky began its daily transformation. The harsh blue dome of midday gradually softened to a paler shade, and wisps of high cirrus clouds appeared like brushstrokes on an artist's canvas. The sun, which had been a burning disk directly overhead, now hung lower in the western sky, its light taking on the warm amber quality that photographers in future centuries would call the golden hour. Silk, Hassan knew from years of experience, was measured in units called jin, each weighing approximately 1 1/3 pounds in the system used by Western merchants. A single bolt of the finest silk from Damascus might contain 40 jinn of material, representing the work of dozens of silkworms over many weeks. The ancient Chinese had perfected a method of unreeling silk from cocoons in a single continuous thread that could stretch for nearly 1,000 meters. And this thread was so fine that it took several of them twisted together to create the strong, lustrous fabric that had given the great trade route its name. Each camel in the caravan carried between 300 and 400 pounds of cargo, a load carefully calculated over generations of desert travel to balance the animal's carrying capacity with its need for mobility and endurance. The camels themselves were masterpieces of natural engineering, their broad, padded feet designed to carry them across sand without sinking, their thick eyelashes and closable nostrils protection against wind-blown dust and sand. The rhythm of the caravan was hypnotic and timeless. Step after step, mile after mile, the travelers maintained a pace that could be sustained from sunrise to sunset without exhausting either human or animal. The soft shuffle of sandaled feet, the muffled thud of camel hooves, the gentle creaking of leather harnesses and wooden saddle frames created a percussion that seemed to merge with the beating of the travelers' own hearts. As the sun continued its ancient journey toward the western horizon, the desert began to reveal its evening colors. The sand, which had appeared almost white in the noon glare, now showed subtle shades of gold, amber, and pale rose. Rocky outcroppings caught and held the light, their surfaces warming from gray to rust to deep orange. Even the sparse vegetation, the hardy shrubs and grasses that somehow found life in this arid landscape, seemed to glow with inner light as the sun's rays slanted across the desert floor. The caravan leader, an experienced guide named Mahmud, whose family had been leading caravans for 7 generations, raised his staff and called out in the mixture of Arabic, Persian, and Turkic languages that served as the common tongue of Silk Road travel. The word he spoke was understood by all. Makar, time to make camp. The selection of a campsite was an art refined over countless generations of desert travel. Mahmud's experienced eye sought the subtle signs that marked a good resting place. A slight depression in the land that would provide shelter from wind, proximity to the ancient stone markers that indicated reliable stopping points, and most importantly, the almost invisible traces that showed this spot had been used by previous caravans. The stone marker beside which they stopped was weathered smooth by centuries of wind and sand. Its carved inscriptions in Arabic, Chinese, and Persian barely visible in the slanting evening light. These markers, placed by long-dead rulers and maintained by the grateful prayers of countless travelers, served as guideposts across the trackless desert, each one representing a known safe harbor in the vast ocean of sand. The process of making camp began immediately, with the practiced efficiency of people who had performed these same tasks hundreds of times before. The camels were unloaded first, each animal guided to its knees with gentle pressure and soft words of encouragement. The great beasts settled to the ground with audible sighs of relief, their long necks stretching forward as they prepared to rest after another day of faithful service. Hassan worked alongside Liwei and Amara to unload the precious cargo, each bundle and crate handled with the careful attention it deserved. The silk bales were covered with thick felt to protect them from the dust and moisture of the desert night. The porcelain crates were arranged in neat rows and covered with oiled canvas to shield them from temperature changes that could cause cracking. The The spice satchels were hung from wooden tripods that lifted them above the sand and allowed air to circulate around them. The unloading process revealed the incredible diversity of goods that traveled the Silk Road. Beyond the silk, porcelain, and spices that formed the core of long-distance trade, the caravan carried smaller luxury items that commanded high prices in distant markets. Jade ornaments carved by master craftsmen in Khotan, gold jewelry worked in the distinctive style of Samarkand artisans, ivory chess pieces from India carved with intricate geometric patterns, and small glass vessels from Syrian workshops that captured and held light like frozen jewels. Archaeological excavations in future centuries would reveal the traces of ancient campsites along the Silk Road, marked by the distinctive patterns of post holes from tent supports, the circular fire rings where thousands of evening meals had been cooked, and the scattered fragments of pottery, metal, and glass that spoke of international commerce. These archaeological sites would tell the story of a trade network that connected civilizations across 8,000 miles of the Earth's surface. The felt yurts, favored by travelers from the northern steppes, were erected with swift efficiency. These ingenious structures consisted of a collapsible wooden frame that could be assembled in less than an hour, covered with layers of thick felt that provided excellent insulation against both heat and cold. The felt itself was made from sheep's wool that had been carefully cleaned, combed, and pressed into dense mats using techniques developed by nomadic peoples over thousands of years. Chinese merchants like Li Wei often preferred canvas tents reinforced with bamboo poles, structures that could be packed more compactly than yurts, but still provided adequate shelter. The canvas was typically treated with a mixture of pine resin and beeswax that made it water resistant, and the tent floors were lined with woven grass mats that provided insulation from the cold ground. As the tents rose around the stone marker, the camp began to take on the familiar pattern that had evolved through centuries of desert travel. The most valuable cargo was positioned in the center, surrounded by the sleeping areas of the merchants and guards. The camels were hobbled nearby, their front legs loosely tied to prevent them from wandering during the night, while still allowing them to move freely enough to graze on the sparse desert vegetation. The hobbling of camels was an art in itself, requiring knots that would hold securely without chafing the animal's legs. The rope used was typically made from twisted camel hair, strong enough to restrain the powerful animals, but soft enough not to cause injury. Different nomadic peoples had developed their own distinctive knot patterns, and an experienced caravan leader could often identify the origin of a traveler by examining the style of knots used on his animals. The evening fire was built in the center of the camp, in a ring of stones that had been carefully selected for their ability to retain and radiate heat without cracking in the flames. The fuel consisted primarily of dried camel dung, which burned cleanly and provided steady heat, supplemented by whatever dry wood could be gathered from the sparse desert shrubs. The fire-building process was methodical and meditative. First, a small nest of dry grass and shredded bark, then gradually larger pieces of fuel added in a careful pyramid that would ensure steady burning throughout the evening. As the sun settled lower towards the western horizon, its light took on the rich, warm quality that transformed the entire desert landscape. The sand seemed to glow from within, and the mountains that rose in the distance appeared to be carved from burnished copper and gold. The sky itself became a canvas of incredible beauty, painted in shades that ranged from deep blue directly overhead through progressively warmer tones toward the sunset point. Pale blue giving way to lavender, then rose, then gold, then the deep orange red that seemed to set the very air on fire. The camels, now unburdened and hobbled, settled into their evening routine with visible contentment. These remarkable animals, perfectly adapted to desert life, could go for days without water and weeks with minimal food, but they clearly appreciated the comfort of a good camp and the prospect of a night's rest. They folded their long legs beneath their bodies, lowered their heads to the sand, and began the slow, peaceful process of chewing their cud, their large eyes reflecting the growing light of the campfire with an expression of almost philosophical calm. As the last light faded from the western sky, the merchants gathered around the central fire, each bringing samples of their wares to share in the ancient ritual of evening trade discussions. This was not aggressive bargaining, but rather the gentle sharing of information and appreciation that helped build the relationships that made long-distance commerce possible. Hassan carefully unwrapped several bolts of silk from their protective coverings, handling the precious fabric with the reverence it deserved. By firelight, the silk seemed to capture and hold the golden flames, each thread glimmering with its own inner radiance. He displayed samples of different grades, the finest imperial silk, woven from threads so delicate that a single strand could barely be seen by the naked eye. Everyday silk suitable for clothing and household uses, and the specially treated silk used for wrapping and protecting other valuable goods during transport. The process of silk production, Hassan explained to his companions as they examined the lustrous fabric, began in carefully tended groves of mulberry trees. Silkworms, fed exclusively on mulberry leaves, spun their cocoons from a single continuous protein fiber that could stretch for nearly 1,000 meters. The cocoons were then carefully sorted, with the finest specimens reserved for the highest grade silk. They were heated in water to soften the natural gum that held the fibers together. Then the end of the silk thread was carefully found and attached to a spinning wheel that could reel the entire cocoon in one unbroken strand. The spinning process required incredible skill and patience. The water temperature had to be maintained at exactly the right level. Too hot, and the silk would become brittle; too cool, and the gum would not dissolve properly. The tension on the thread had to be constant but gentle, pulling steadily enough to unwind the cocoon, but not so hard as to break the delicate fiber. A master silk spinner could handle threads from 4 or 5 cocoons simultaneously, combining them into a single strand of exactly the right thickness and strength. The dyeing of silk was equally complex, requiring knowledge passed down through generations of craftsmen. Different colors required different mordants, chemical agents that helped the dye bond permanently to the silk fibers. Madder root produced shades of red that ranged from pale rose to deep crimson, depending on the concentration and the mineral content of the water used. Indigo created the deep blues that were prized throughout Asia, but the fermentation process required to prepare indigo dye could take weeks and demanded constant attention. Saffron, the most expensive dye of all, produced a golden yellow so vibrant it seemed to glow with inner light. But it took the stigmas from over 150 flowers to produce just 1 gram of saffron threads. Li Wei unpacked several pieces of porcelain with extreme care, each vessel wrapped in layers of silk, and nestled in specially carved wooden cradles. The firelight revealed the extraordinary beauty of these ceramic masterpieces. Bowls so thin that light could be seen through their walls, vases decorated with painted landscapes that seemed to contain entire worlds, and cups glazed in the distinctive blue white that had made Chinese porcelain famous throughout the known world. The creation of fine porcelain, Li Wei told his listeners, as they passed the delicate vessels from hand to hand, was a process that could take months from start to finish. It began with kaolin clay, a pure white clay found only in certain mountainous regions of China. This clay had to be carefully purified, with all impurities removed by repeated washing and settling. The clay was then aged, sometimes for years, to develop the proper plasticity and workability. The shaping of porcelain required master craftsmen whose skills had been developed over decades of training. The clay was worked on potter's wheels, turned by apprentices, allowing the master to focus entirely on the delicate process of raising the walls of a vessel. The thickness had to be perfectly uniform. Too thick, and the piece would crack during firing. Too thin, and it would collapse under its own weight. After shaping, the vessels were dried slowly and carefully to prevent cracking, then fired once at a relatively low temperature to create what potters called bisqueware. They were then glazed, painted with a mixture of ground minerals and flux that would melt during the second firing to create the smooth glass-like surface that made porcelain both beautiful and functional. The glazing process was where much of the artistry lay. Different combinations of minerals produced different colors and effects. Copper oxide created the famous Chinese red that seemed to glow like captured fire. Iron oxide produced the subtle brown and black tones used for landscape paintings, and cobalt created the deep blue that remained stable at the high temperatures required for porcelain firing. The kilns used for firing porcelain were marvels of engineering built into hillsides to take advantage of natural draft and constructed with specially designed chambers that could reach and maintain temperatures of over 1300 degrees Celsius. The firing process took days, with temperatures raised gradually to prevent thermal shock, maintained at peak heat for precise periods, then lowered slowly to room temperature. Opening a kiln was always a moment of high anticipation and anxiety, as even the most experienced potter could never be completely certain which pieces would emerge perfect and which would show the flaws that made them unsuitable for sale. The journey from workshop to market was almost as challenging as the creation process itself. Each piece of porcelain was individually wrapped and cushioned, then packed in wooden crates with sawdust, dried grass, or sheep's wool. Despite these precautions, breakage was common, and the porcelain that survived the journey commanded high prices that reflected not only its beauty and utility, but the considerable risks involved in bringing it to market. Amara opened her leather satchels and displayed an array of aromatic treasures that filled the evening air with exotic fragrances. She had cinnamon bark from Ceylon, still bearing the sweet, woody scent that made it worth its weight in silver in the markets of Europe. Cardamom pods from the western Ghats of India released their complex aroma when gently crushed between the fingers, a scent that combined lemon, eucalyptus, and camphor in perfect balance. Star anise from the mountains of southern China added its distinctive licorice fragrance to the mix, while threads of saffron glowed like captured sunlight in their small silk pouch. The preservation of spices during long-distance transport Amara explained as her companions inhaled the intoxicating aromas, required knowledge and techniques developed over centuries of trade. Each spice had its own requirements. Cinnamon bark stayed freshest when kept in large pieces and broken only just before sale. Cardamom pods retained their oils best when stored whole and unopened, and saffron maintained its color and potency only when protected from light and moisture. The leather containers used for spice transport were specially prepared. The hides were selected from young animals whose skin was naturally finer and more flexible. They were tanned using oak bark and other materials that would not impart unwanted flavors to the spices, then treated with cedar oil that acted as a natural preservative and insect repellent. The satchels were lined with oiled silk that provided an additional barrier against moisture while allowing the leather to breathe. The harvesting of saffron, the most precious of all spices, was a process that required enormous labor and perfect timing. The purple crocuses from which saffron came bloomed for only a few weeks each year, and the flowers had to be picked at dawn when the stigmas contained the highest concentration of the aromatic oils that gave saffron its value. Each flower contained only 3 stigmas, and these had to be carefully removed by hand and dried immediately to preserve their quality. It took over 150 flowers to produce just 1 gram of saffron threads, which explained why this spice was literally worth its weight in gold. Cardamom cultivation in the misty mountains of southern India followed seasonal patterns that had been established for thousands of years. The plants grew in the shade of larger trees, protecting them from direct sunlight, while the mountain mists provided the constant moisture they needed. The pods were harvested when they reached exactly 3/4 of their full size. Too early, and they would lack flavor. Too late, and they would split open and lose their essential oils. The harvesting was done by hand, with experienced workers able to judge the perfect moment for each individual pod. As the merchants shared their knowledge and their wares, the desert night settled around them with its profound quiet. The temperature dropped steadily as the earth radiated away the heat it had absorbed during the day, and the travelers drew closer to the warming fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the tent walls and illuminated the faces of the gathered merchants with a warm golden light that emphasized the international character of Silk Road trade. Asian features beside Middle Eastern, Northern European alongside Southern, each face telling the story of different peoples united by the common language of commerce and mutual respect. The evening meal was prepared with the same methodical care that characterized all aspects of caravan life. Water, precious in the desert, was used sparingly but effectively. Tea was brewed in copper kettles that had been burnished to mirror brightness. The metal chosen not just for its beauty, but for its excellent heat conduction properties. The tea itself was a blend of leaves from China and herbs from the Central Asian steppes, creating a beverage that was both refreshing and mildly medicinal. The bread that accompanied the meal had been baked that morning in the traditional manner of desert travelers. Flat rounds of dough were cooked on hot stones that had been heated in the fire, creating a bread that was sturdy enough for travel yet tender and flavorful. The grain used was typically wheat or barley that had been ground by hand in small stone querns, preserving the nutrients and flavor that were lost in more intensive processing methods. Dates provided natural sweetness and concentrated nutrition. These fruits, grown in oases scattered across the desert regions, were naturally preserved by their high sugar content and could be kept for months without spoiling. The best dates were large and soft, with a texture like fine leather and a flavor that combined honey, caramel, and subtle floral notes. They were often stuffed with nuts, almonds from the mountains of Persia, pistachios from the hills of Syria, or walnuts from the valleys of Anatolia. The nuts themselves were nutritional powerhouses perfectly suited to the needs of long-distance travelers. Almonds provided protein and healthy oils that sustained energy over long periods. Pistachios contained minerals that helped prevent the muscle cramps that could result from long days of walking in desert heat. Walnuts offered omega-3 fatty acids that supported brain function and overall health during the stresses of travel. The brewing of tea was almost a ceremonial process, performed with careful attention to temperature and timing that reflected both practical necessity and cultural tradition. The water was heated to exactly the right temperature, hot enough to extract the beneficial compounds from the tea leaves, but not so hot as to create bitterness. Different types of tea required different steeping times. Delicate green teas from China needed only a few minutes, while the robust black teas preferred in Central Asia could steep for much longer without becoming unpalatable. As they shared their simple but nourishing meal, the merchants began to exchange words and phrases in their different languages, creating a gentle language lesson that served both practical and social purposes. Hassan taught his companions Arabic words for the stars that were beginning to appear overhead. Najma for a single star, Buruj for the constellations, Layl for the peaceful night that surrounded them. Li Wei shared Chinese terms that captured concepts sometimes missing from other languages. Xing for star, but also Mingxing for the brightest stars that served as navigational guides, and Tianmu for the canopy of heaven that arched over them. Amara contributed Persian words that were particularly beautiful when spoken aloud. Sitara for star, with its musical syllables that seemed to sparkle like the celestial objects they described. And Shab for night, a word that seemed to contain within itself the peaceful darkness that was settling over the desert. These language exchanges were more than mere vocabulary lessons. They were expressions of the cultural mixing that made Silk Road civilization so rich and diverse. The soft sounds of a wooden flute began to drift across the campfire as one of the travelers, a pilgrim bound for the holy sites of Central Asia, took out his instrument and began to play. The melody was simple and haunting, based on the pentatonic scales that were common to musical traditions from China to Turkey. The five-note structure created melodies that seemed to capture the vast spaces of the desert and the endless arch of the star-filled sky. Musical instruments traveled the Silk Road, along with goods and ideas, and each region had developed its own variations on common themes. The wooden flute being played tonight was carved from bamboo that had grown in the river valleys of western China. Its tone holes positioned according to mathematical ratios that had been worked out by Chinese music theorists centuries earlier. But the melody being played incorporated Persian rhythmic patterns and Arabic ornamental phrases, creating a musical fusion that could only have emerged from the multicultural environment of the great trade routes. The pentatonic scale used in much Silk Road music was based on mathematical relationships that ancient theorists had discovered between musical intervals and cosmic harmony. The five notes were arranged in ratios that created natural consonances, producing melodies that seemed to resonate with something deep in human consciousness. These scales were found in musical traditions separated by thousands of miles, suggesting either ancient cultural connections or something universal in human response to these particular mathematical relationships. As the evening progressed, the fire was gradually built up for the night, with larger pieces of fuel added to create a bed of coals that would provide warmth through the cooler hours before dawn. The banking of a fire was a skill that required understanding of how different materials burned. Dry camel dung for steady heat, twisted grass for quick flames, and precious pieces of wood for the long burning coals that would maintain temperature through the night. The conversations around the fire began to turn toward home and family, the universal topics that brought together travelers from different cultures and backgrounds. Hassan spoke of his wife and children in Damascus, of the courtyard house with its fountain and fruit trees where his family waited for his return. Li Wei described the ancestral home in Xi'an, where his porcelain workshop continued the traditions begun by his great-grandfather. Amara shared stories of Bukhara's famous markets, where merchants from across Central Asia gathered to trade in the great covered bazaars that had served as commercial centers for over 1,000 years. These personal stories, shared in the intimate setting of the campfire, revealed the human dimension of long-distance trade. Behind every bale of silk, every piece of porcelain, every satchel of spices lay a network of relationships. Craftsmen and their families, merchants and their customers, the communities that produced trade goods, and the distant markets that consumed them. The Silk Road was not just a route for moving goods across continents. It was a network of human connections that linked peoples and cultures across the breadth of the known world. As full darkness settled over the desert, the sky began to reveal the spectacular celestial display that had guided travelers for thousands of years before the invention of the magnetic compass. In the clear, dry air of the high desert, far from any sources of artificial light, the stars appeared with an intensity and clarity that was breathtaking even to experienced desert travelers. The first stars to appear were the brightest ones, the stellar beacons that served as primary navigation points for caravan leaders. Polaris, the North Star, appeared directly above the northern horizon, its position marking true north with an accuracy that made it the most important single reference point for desert navigation. Around Polaris, the circumpolar constellations wheeled in their eternal dance. Ursa Major, the Great Bear, whose 7 brightest stars formed the asterism known to Arab astronomers as the Great Wagon, and Ursa Minor, the Little Bear, whose tail pointed directly to the pole star. Hassan, whose knowledge of desert navigation had been essential to his success as a long-distance trader, pointed out the key stellar landmarks to his companions. The constellation Arabs called Aldebaran, the Follower, was rising in the east, its bright red star Aldebaran marking the eye of Taurus the Bull. This constellation's position indicated the time of night and the season of the year, information essential for travelers who needed to coordinate their journeys with favorable weather and the availability of water at oases along their route. Islamic astronomy had made remarkable contributions to the science of celestial navigation. Arab astronomers had improved on the Greek astrolabe, creating instruments capable of determining latitude with remarkable precision. They had mapped the positions of over 1,000 stars, giving them names that were still used by astronomers in future centuries: Aldebaran, Altair, Deneb, Rigel, Betelgeuse, a stellar nomenclature that preserved Arabic contributions to astronomical knowledge. The astrolabe, an ingenious device that could be used to determine time, direction, and position from stellar observations, was a masterpiece of medieval technology. It consisted of a circular baseplate marked with coordinate lines and star positions, topped by a rotating network that could be adjusted to match the current sky. By aligning the astrolabe with key stars and reading the positions of various pointers and scales, a skilled navigator could determine his latitude to within a degree or two. Remarkable accuracy for a handheld instrument. Chinese astronomers had their own rich tradition of celestial observation and navigation. They divided the sky into 28 lunar mansions, each associated with specific stars or asterisms that rose at different times of year. These lunar mansions had poetic names that reflected Chinese aesthetic sensibilities. The azure dragon of the east, the white tiger of the west, the black turtle of the north, and the vermilion bird of the south. Each direction was associated with specific colors, seasons, and symbolic meanings that gave Chinese astronomy a philosophical depth that complemented its practical applications. The Chinese star charts that Li Wei had studied in his youth were works of art as well as scientific instruments. They depicted the constellations as stylized figures drawn in flowing lines, with the brightest stars marked in gold ink and the fainter ones in silver. These charts were painted on silk scrolls that could be rolled up for travel, and they included detailed tables showing the rising and setting times of key stars throughout the year. As more stars became visible, the desert sky began to reveal its full glory. The Milky Way, invisible in the bright skies of cities, but spectacular in the clear desert air, stretched across the heavens like a river of light. Arab astronomers called it Nar al-Sama, the river of heaven, while Chinese scholars knew it as Yanhe, the silver river. This pale band of light was actually composed of countless individual stars, too faint to see separately, but visible as a glowing pathway that seemed to connect Earth with the furthest reaches of the cosmos. The constellation patterns, visible from the Central Asian desert, included stellar groupings known to cultures around the world. Orion, the great hunter of Greek mythology, was known to Arab astronomers as Al-Jawza, the central one, while Chinese astronomers saw in the same star pattern the figure of a great general. The bright star, Sirius, the dog star of Western tradition, was called Al-Shira al-Yamaniya by Arab astronomers, the southern Sirius, to distinguish it from Procyon, which they called the northern Sirius. Different cultures had developed their own ways of dividing and naming the constellations, but certain patterns seem to be recognized by peoples around the world. The Big Dipper asterism was seen as a wagon or cart by cultures from Europe to Asia, while the Southern Cross, visible from more southerly latitudes, served as a navigation aid for travelers in the Indian Ocean and beyond. The seasonal visibility of different constellations provided natural calendars for peoples around the world. The rising of certain star groups before dawn indicated the proper times for planting crops, beginning journeys, or performing religious ceremonies. Along the Silk Road, merchants and caravan leaders used these celestial calendars to plan their travel schedules, timing their journeys to take advantage of favorable weather and avoid the extreme conditions of winter or the height of summer. The profound silence of the desert night was broken only by the gentle sounds of a camp settling in for the night. the soft breathing of sleeping camels, the quiet crackle of embers in the dying fire, the rustle of tent fabric in the light breeze that often arose after sunset in desert regions. These peaceful sounds created a natural white noise that was conducive to rest and sleep, while the spectacular star display overhead reminded the travelers of their place in the vast cosmos. The merchants took turns pointing out constellations and sharing the stories their cultures told about the star patterns. Hassan spoke of the Arabic tradition that saw in the stars the campfires of ancient Bedouin tribes, forever traveling across the heavens in their eternal nomadic journey. Li Wei shared Chinese legends that told of the weaver girl and the cowherd, lovers separated by the silver river of the Milky Way, and allowed to meet only once a year when magpies formed a bridge across the celestial stream. Amara contributed Persian astronomical poetry that described the stars as holes in the crystal dome of heaven, through which the divine light of paradise could be glimpsed by mortal eyes. These stories, passed down through generations of storytellers and astronomers, reflected the human need to find meaning and pattern in the seemingly random distribution of stars across the night sky. The contemplation of the night sky had a naturally calming effect that prepared the mind and body for rest. The vast scale of the stellar universe put the concerns and anxieties of daily life into perspective, while the slow, regular motions of the stars and planets provided a sense of cosmic order that was deeply reassuring. This was the same sky that had been observed by countless generations of travelers, the same star patterns that had guided caravans across these deserts for thousands of years. As the evening moved toward its close, the merchants began the gentle process of preparing for sleep. The fire was carefully banked, with the largest pieces of fuel arranged to provide steady heat through the coolest hours before dawn. This was a delicate process that required understanding of how different materials burned. The camel dung that formed the base of the fuel provided steady, long-lasting heat, while the precious pieces of dry wood saved for nighttime use would burn slowly enough to maintain temperature until morning. The banking process began with creating a solid bed of coals by allowing smaller pieces of fuel to burn down completely. These coals were then arranged in a compact mound and covered with a layer of sand or ash that would control the rate of burning. Larger pieces of fuel were placed around and over this central core, positioned so that they would catch and burn gradually as the night progressed. The traditional bedding arrangements used by Silk Road travelers had been perfected over centuries of desert camping. The foundation was typically a woven grass mat or felt carpet that provided insulation from the cold ground. Over this were laid layers of blankets and quilts made from materials chosen for their warmth and portability. Camel hair for its excellent insulating properties, sheep's wool for softness and moisture resistance, and silk for its remarkable ability to provide warmth without weight. The sleeping arrangements reflected both practical necessity and cultural tradition. Merchants traveling together often shared sleeping areas for warmth and security, while maintaining the privacy and respect appropriate to their different cultural backgrounds. The most valuable cargo was positioned in the center of the camp, where it could be easily guarded, while the sleeping areas formed protective rings around these precious goods. Before settling for the night, the travelers performed the evening prayers and blessings appropriate to their different religious traditions. Hassan faced toward Mecca, and recited the evening prayers prescribed by Islamic tradition. His quiet Arabic phrases drifting across the campfire as he performed the ritual ablutions and prostrations that connected him with the divine and with Muslim communities around the world. Li Wei performed the quieter contemplative practices of his Buddhist tradition, sitting in meditation posture and focusing his attention on the breathing techniques that were designed to quiet the mind and prepare it for rest. His practice included recitation of protective mantras and dedication of merit that would ensure peaceful sleep and safe travel for all members of the caravan. Amara whispered Zoroastrian prayers that honored the sacred fire as a symbol of divine light and truth, her Persian phrases asking for protection during the vulnerable hours of sleep and guidance for the journey ahead. The ancient Persian religion that she followed emphasized the cosmic battle between light and darkness, and the evening prayers were designed to invoke the powers of light for protection during the hours when darkness held sway over the earth. These diverse religious practices, performed side by side around the same campfire, demonstrated the remarkable religious tolerance that characterized Silk Road civilization. Traders and travelers from different faiths lived and worked together in harmony, bound by the common challenges of long-distance travel and the mutual respect that came from shared hardships and dangers. The gradual settling of the camp created its own peaceful rhythm. Conversations grew quieter and more reflective as the evening progressed. The last of the tea was shared from the copper kettle, its warmth spreading through the travelers' bodies and helping to prepare them for sleep. The merchants carefully stored their most precious goods in their personal sleeping areas, where body warmth and constant proximity would provide additional protection against the temperature fluctuations and moisture that could damage delicate materials. The ritual of laying out sleeping rugs and blankets was performed with the same careful attention that characterized all aspects of caravan life. Each textile served a specific purpose. The bottom layer of woven grass mats provided essential insulation from the cold earth. The middle layers of wool and felt offered warmth and cushioning, and the top covers of silk or fine cotton gave protection from wind and sand while allowing the skin to breathe during sleep. The textiles used for bedding represented some of the finest craftsmanship available along the Silk Road. The grass mats were woven by nomadic peoples using techniques that created incredibly durable yet flexible surfaces. The patterns woven into these mats often had symbolic meanings, geometric designs that were believed to provide protection during sleep, or representations of natural forms like mountains and rivers that connected the sleeper with the beneficial forces of nature. Woolen blankets came from sheep that grazed on the high steppes of Central Asia, where the extreme temperature variations produced wool with exceptional insulating properties. The sheep developed dense undercoats that trapped air for insulation, while their outer wool provided protection from wind and moisture. When properly processed and woven, this wool created textiles that could keep a person warm in temperatures well below freezing, while remaining comfortable when the temperature rose. The felt used in many sleeping arrangements was created through an ancient process that transformed loose wool fibers into a dense, mat-like material. Wool was first cleaned and carded to align the fibers, then laid out in overlapping layers with the grain running in different directions. The layers were then moistened with hot water and worked by hand or with wooden tools. causing the natural scales on the wool fibers to interlock and create a unified fabric that was both strong and insulating. As the merchants settled into their sleeping arrangements, the sounds of the camp gradually diminished to the gentle background noise that was conducive to peaceful rest. The camels had long since finished their evening meal of sparse desert grasses and had settled into their characteristic sleeping position, with their long legs folded beneath their bodies and their heads resting on the sand. Their breathing was deep and regular, producing soft rumbling sounds that added to the camp's peaceful atmosphere. The dying fire continued to provide gentle warmth and the faint crackling sounds that many people found soothing as they prepared for sleep. The carefully banked coals glowed with a steady red light that would maintain their heat for hours, while the larger pieces of fuel burned slowly and quietly, occasionally settling with soft whispers as they consumed themselves in the controlled combustion that would keep the camp warm through the coolest hours before dawn. Above them, the spectacular star display continued its ancient progression across the desert sky. The constellations that had been rising in the east when the camp was established were now well up in the sky, while new star patterns were appearing on the eastern horizon. This slow, stately movement of the heavens provided a natural clock that experienced desert travelers could read as easily as others might consult a timepiece. The Milky Way had reached its position of greatest prominence, stretching directly overhead like a celestial river that connected all the scattered stars into one vast interconnected system. In the crystal clear air of the high desert, individual stars within the Milky Way became visible, creating a sense of depth and infinity that was both humbling and comforting. The temperature had dropped to the cool but comfortable level that was ideal for sleep in desert regions. During the day, the sand and rocks absorbed enormous amounts of solar energy, but after sunset, this heat radiated quickly back into the clear, dry air. The result was a natural cooling system that made desert nights pleasant, even in regions where daytime temperatures could be almost unbearable. The gentle breeze that often arose in desert regions after sunset stirred the tent walls with soft, rhythmic movements that created their own form of white noise. This breeze was caused by the differential cooling rates of different surfaces. The sand cooled more quickly than rocks or vegetation, creating small pressure differences that generated these mild air currents. As sleep approached, the merchant's thoughts turned to the journey ahead and the distant destinations that awaited them. Hassan contemplated the markets of Kashgar, where his fine Damascus silk would be eagerly sought by merchants heading further east toward China. The silk trade was ancient and honorable, connecting the mulberry groves and workshops of Syria with customers thousands of miles away who appreciated the unique qualities of Middle Eastern textile craftsmanship. Li Wei's thoughts drifted to the reception his porcelain would receive in the bazaars of Central Asia, where ceramic goods from China were prized not only for their beauty, but for their practical superiority to locally made pottery. Chinese porcelain was harder, more durable, and more resistant to thermal shock than other ceramics available in medieval markets. The secret of its manufacture was closely guarded, making genuine Chinese porcelain a luxury item that commanded high prices across the known world. Amara reflected on the spice markets that awaited her in the great commercial centers ahead. Her carefully preserved saffron, cardamom, and cinnamon would bring exotic flavors to cuisines thousands of miles from their places of origin. The spice trade was perhaps the most romantic and lucrative of all medieval commerce, dealing in products that were literally worth their weight in precious metals and could transform the entire character of a meal or a medicine. The three merchants, despite their different cultural backgrounds and specialties, shared the common experience of long-distance traders. The mixture of excitement and apprehension that came with carrying valuable goods across uncertain terrain. The satisfaction of connecting distant producers with distant consumers, and the deep sense of participating in something larger than any individual transaction. The great web of commerce and cultural exchange that made civilization possible. As their breathing deepened and their thoughts became less focused, the merchants began to experience the peaceful transition from waking consciousness to the restorative state of sleep. Their minds, tired from a full day of travel and trading, began to release the accumulated tensions and concerns that had occupied them during their waking hours. The sounds of the camp settled into the gentle, regular rhythms that would continue through the night. The soft breathing of sleeping humans and animals, the quiet crackling of the carefully tended fire, the whisper of wind through tent fabric and across sand dunes. These sounds created a natural symphony that seemed to merge with the vast silence of the desert itself. The star patterns overhead continued their slow rotation around the celestial pole, marking the passage of hours in the ancient system that had served as humanity's first clock. Each constellation that rose brought the camp closer to dawn and the beginning of another day's journey along the ancient path that connected east and west. In this peaceful setting, surrounded by the timeless beauty of the desert night and the infinite canopy of stars, the merchants of the Silk Road prepared to join the ranks of countless travelers who had slept under these same stars, following these same routes, carrying the goods and ideas that built the foundations of global civilization. Their dreams would be filled with images of distant markets and exotic goods, of friends and family in far-off cities, and of the endless road that stretched ahead, promising new adventures and new opportunities with each day's travel. The ancient path that had carried them to this resting place would carry them forward again with tomorrow's sunrise. But for now, they rested in the perfect peace of a desert night, their sleep guarded by stars that had watched over travelers for thousands of years and would continue their faithful vigil for thousands more. In their dreams, they would travel not just across the physical distances of continents, but across the timeless landscapes of human hope and ambition, where every journey was both an ending and a beginning, every destination both a goal achieved and a starting point for journeys yet to come. The night embraced them with its profound quiet, its gentle warmth, and its infinite sky, providing the deep rest that would prepare them for another day of travel along the Silk Road, that ancient pathway of dreams where east met west under the eternal stars.